Page 196. Prostitution in Ancient India. Sukumari Bhattacharjee. The earliest mention of prostitution occurs in the Rig Veda, the most ancient literary work of India. At first, however, we hear of the illicit lover, Jara and Jatini, male and female lover of a married spouse. What distinguished such an illicit lover from the professional prostitute or her client is the regular payment for favors received. When we merely hear of an illicit lover, there may or may not have been an exchange of gift. In a case of mutual consent, gifts must have been optional. In the remote days of barter economy, when money or currency was yet unknown, such gifts were equivalent to payment in cash. Clearly, even in the earliest Vedic age, love outside wedlock was a familiar phenomenon, and unions promoted by mere lust are mentioned in quite an uninhibited manner. Para. After the earliest Vedic literature, between the 12th and the 13th centuries BC, bracket opens, that is Rig Veda, books 2 to 7, bracket closes, we have a vast literature which covers the period between the 8th and the 5th centuries BC. In this literature, too, we hear of the woman of easy virtue, of the wife's illicit love affairs. Stop, footnote 1, para. Extramarital love may have been voluntary and unpaid, but there is the possibility of it being regarded by the male partner as a form of service for which he was obliged to pay in some form. But as long as it was confined to a particular person, it was a temporary contract and was not regarded as a profession. The later Pali term, muhutta, muhutta, bracket, lasting for an instant, bracket closes, comma, or its Sanskrit equivalent, muhurtika, signified such purely temporary unions with no lasting relationship or obligation. Such affairs may have been voluntary or professional, depending on the attitude of the partners. Para. Gradually, there arose a section of women who, either because they could not find suitable husbands or because of early widowhood, unsatisfactory married life, or other social pressures, especially if they had been violated, abducted, or forcibly enjoyed, and so denied an honorable status in society, or had been given away as gifts in religious or secular events, page 197, such women were frequently forced to take up prostitution as a profession. And when they did so, they found themselves in a unique position. They constituted the only section of women who had to be their own breadwinners and guardians. All the others, maiden daughters, sisters, wives, widows, and maidservants, were wards of men, fathers, brothers, husbands, masters, or sons. Footnote 2. So women who took up prostitution had to be reasonably sure of an independent livelihood. Their customers had to make it a viable proposition for them. Economic status. It is easy to see that all avenues to prostitution did not offer the same kind of economic security. A wrecked woman had little chance of an honorable marriage and social rehabilitation. So reduced to prostitution, she had to accept whatever came her way. This also held true for the old maid turned prostitute. But a young widow or a pretty wanton maid or an unhappily married attractive woman could perhaps choose her partner and name her price, at least in the beginning of her career, while she still enjoyed the protection of her father's, husband's, or in-laws' home. We have absolutely no way of knowing when prostitution in India arose as a recognizable profession or how much the prostitute received by way of payment. Its emergence and recognition as a profession was presumably concomitant with the institution of strict marriage rules, especially monoandry, monoandry, and the wife being regarded as the private property of her husband. The terms sadharani or samanya (common) comma, synonyms for prostitute, distinguish her as a woman not possessed by one man. This is the desideratum. When a woman does not belong to one man but obliges many, as the terms varangana, varastri, varavadu, and varamukhya, footnote 3, signify, since she is not the responsibility of any one man, she looks after herself. She does by accepting payment from each of the men she obliges. She then becomes panyastri, one whose flavors can be bought with money. Para. The process of the emergence of prostitution must have been slow, varying from region to region and from age to age. By the later Vedic age, that is around the 8th or 7th century BC, we have references to a more regularized form of prostitution recognized as a social institution. Early Buddhist literature, especially the Jatakas, bear testimony to the existence of different categories of prostitutes, page 198, and incidentally provide some information about their fees as also of their financial position. Para. Professional prostitution presupposes an economic condition in which surplus was produced, a surplus which also earned prosperity from abroad through trade and commerce. It also presupposes the rise of petty principalities, the breakdown of tribal society, the rise of the joint or extended family, and the social subjugation of women in general. In a settled agricultural community, the woman gradually lost social mobility and a measure of freedom that she had been enjoying before. She became man's ward, possession, object of enjoyment. Also, with the accumulation of private property, the wife was more jealously guarded and jealously watched over. Society was now polygamous. Polyandry disappeared except in some small pockets. Para. Whether as an unmarried girl, a wife, or a widow, she belonged to some man. So other men could not approach her without trespassing on the owner's property rights. Pleasure outside the home, therefore, had to be paid for. Hence, prostitution had to be institutionalized so that there was an assurance of a steady supply for ready payment. It must have been a long and tortuous process for women of this profession to congregate in a quote, red light area, unquote, comma, away from the village and later also from towns when men could go and seek their company. Social ostracism on the one hand and professional solidarity of the guild type of association on the other ensured their security and prosperity. Para. In Vedic literature, especially in the Oitoreo and Shankayana Aranyakas, the prostitute is mentioned in an apparently obscene altercation with the neophyte Brahmacharin. In the Vratya Sukha of the Atharva Veda, she follows the Magadha. These are clearly part of her fertility ritual. It is in this role that she has persisted in ritual and literature down the ages. Para. There are various myths and legends regarding the origin of prostitution. The Mahabharata account of the destruction of the Yadavas and Vrishnis, footnote 4, ends with the women of these tribes being abducted by barbarian brigands. In the Kuru and Panchala regions, footnote 5, inhabited by the Madras and the Sindhu Sauviras, the Brahmana sages, Dalpya, Chaikityayana, and Svetaketu's nephew, Ashtavakra, was said to be associated with the teaching of erotics in which prostitution constitutes a section. In the Mahabharata, footnote 6, and the Matsya Purana, footnote 7, we are given fictitious accounts of the origin of prostitution. Kshemendra says, page 199, that wicked mothers gave their daughters enjoyed and abandoned by men to others, footnote 8. Vatsyayana, in his Kama Sutra, gives detailed instructions on how a chaste girl should be seduced cleverly until she yields to a man's lust. Footnote 9. Presumably, when such a man abandoned her, she was forced to adopt prostitution as a profession. We also hear of the Jayopajivins or Jayajivins, husbands who lived on the wife's income, which she earned by selling herself. This itself was regarded as a minor sin on the husband's part, an upapataka which could be expiated by taking the comparatively mild Chandrayana vow. Footnote 10. All these texts reveal to us some of the channels by which women came to prostitution. Another old channel of the supply of prostitutes was young virgins given away as gifts on special religious and secular occasions. The number of such girls given away to brahmanas, guests, priests, sons-in-law is staggering. In later Vedic times, we hear of dakshinas, sacrificial fees to officiating priests. Such fees included horses, cattle, gold, and also women of various categories, unmarried, married without children, and married with children. One wonders what a priest did with hundreds of such women. Some he could marry, others he would enjoy and abandon, still others he would employ as maidservants. Many of these would later find their way to brothels or to slave markets. Yet another source of supply was the royal palace. A king could summon pretty maids to his palace, enjoy them for some days, and then send them away. In the Vatsagulma region, ministers' wives had to oblige the king by paying visits, bracket on being summoned, bracket closes, to the palace. In Vidarbha, pretty maids were enjoyed by the king for a month and then sent away. When such women came out of the palace, one obvious solution for their future life was prostitution. Of course, courtiers would sometimes marry some of them, but the rest had few alternative courses open to them. Kautilya says that prostitutes were recruited from four sources. Either they were born as prostitutes' daughters, or they were purchased or captured in war, or they were women who had been punished for adultery. Footnote 11, para. Finally, a total abhorrent manner of procuring women for temple prostitution was buying women and giving them to the temples. Such donors were said to grow rich in this life and live in heaven for a long time. We hear that he gave a host of prostitutes to the sun god, went to the region of the sun after death. Footnote 12, para. Temple dancers do not appear before the last few centuries BC and are mentioned frequently in the early centuries AD in some regions. Page 200. The Jatakas do not know them. Greek visitors after Alexander do not mention them. Even Kautilya does not associate professional dancers with temple prostitution. Evidently, the institution arose in the troubled period of foreign invasion before and after the early centuries AD. Kalidasa in the 5th century AD assumes their existence and function as an established tradition. Footnote 13. From the 6th century AD onwards, literature and epigraphy bear many evidences of its existence. Para. As townships and cities arose along the trade routes in northern India around the 6th century BC, internal and maritime trade flourished in these, and towns and cities became centers where courtesans piled their trade and attracted money from travelers, merchants, soldiers, and men of various trades. These courtesans were trained in many arts, and if they were young and pretty, they could amass a fortune, but evidently only the exceptionally beautiful, young, and accomplished among them were so fortunate. Since entertainment was their primary function, they had to provide song, dance, music, and various other kinds of pleasure. They had to keep a troupe, troupe, of artists in the different fields in readiness for the cultivated customer. To the upper class of courtesans sometimes came men of refined aesthetic sensibilities and intellectual ability, hence they were obliged to provide entertainment like the hostesses of the French salons of the last century or the Japanese geisha girls. They themselves were trained in the various arts, including literature, for their training was quite lengthy and elaborate. We hear of texts composed for such training. These are called Vaishika Tantra. But every courtesan could not herself provide all kinds of aesthetic pleasure, so they had to make an initial and also recurring investment for training and maintaining a troupe of artists. Occasionally the royal treasury came to her aid. Para. Chief courtesans of prosperous cities and towns maintained their own train of singers and dancing girls. Royal courts also patronized such singers and dancers who could be enjoyed by the king and his favorites and who could also be employed as spies. Para. From the earliest times, we have many different names for courtesans. The Rig Veda knows the Hasra, Hsra, a frivolous woman, and the Agru, Agru, footnote 14, and the Sadharani, footnote 15. The Atharva Veda knows the Punshali, she who walks among men, footnote 16. The Mahanagari, she of great nakedness, that is, who bears herself to many, is mentioned in the Atharva Veda, footnote 17. Ati Shakadvari and Upper Sakadvari, women with fancy dress and bare bosoms, are mentioned in the Taittiriya Brahmana, footnote 18, page 201. Rajayitri, she who entertains and is given to sensuality, also figures in some texts, footnote 19. Samanya and Sadharani are generic terms for the common woman, footnote 20. In the Mahabharata rite, the Pumschali, a prostitute, pairs ritually with a brahmacharin, footnote 20. Footnote 21. The Kama Sutra in the 2nd or 1st century BC mentions the Kumbhadasi and Parivarka maidservants who could also be enjoyed at will. Kulota and Shwairini, wanton women. Nari, the actress. Nati, N-A-T-I, Nati, the actress. Shilpakarika, she who is engaged in arts and crafts. Prakasavinasta, the openly defiled one. Rupa Jiva and Ganika are courtesans with different social ranks. Para. The Jatakas mention Vannadasi, Vesi, Nariya, Gamaniya, and Nagara Sobhani Itti, footnote 22, Mohottika, footnote 23, and Janapada Kalyani are mentioned in several Buddhist texts in the sense of the most beautiful women who can be enjoyed by an entire Janapada. The Ganika must initially have connoted a woman at the disposal of all the members of a Gana, a tribe, and later of the political unit or constituent of a confederacy. Some later names includes Salabhanjika, who is no other than a prostitute in Jatadhara's dictionary. Next section, variations in status and functions, continued in next file. Page 201. Variations in status and functions. This profusion of synonyms cannot be explained by regional or temporal variations only. It also signifies the social and financial status of the various categories of courtesans. Footnote 24. The numerous synonyms also testify to the widespread presence of the institution through the ages. Para. The Rupa Jiva was not accomplished in the arts like the Gonika. Her only stock in trade, as the name signifies, was her beauty and charm. She owed the state 2 days' income for a month. If a man forcibly enjoyed her, he was fined 12 panas, but in times of crisis, half her monthly income could be forfeited to the state. Footnote 25. She could also belong to the royal harem, footnote 26, and could also be exclusively kept by one man, in which case another enjoying her was fined 48 panas, footnote 27. Disguised as a wife, She could help a man escape and could also be employed by the state as a spy. Footnote 28. Vatsyayana also mentions the Rupa Jiva, footnote 29. Another name of the mistress of one individual man is Avaruddha. The Rupa Dasi was unaccomplished and was employed in the personal attendance of a wealthy man. Like the Vanna Dasi mentioned in the Jatakas, she could entertain customers on her own or serve under some other person. Footnote 30. The Gonika Dasi was a female slave, page 202, of the Gonika who could also become independent and set up her own establishment. The Samajataka mentions Sama, a courtesan of Kashi, who had a retinue of 500 Ganika Dasis, footnote 31, full stop. Other common and late names are Varangana, Varavadhu, Varamukhya, all of which stand for a prostitute, while Vrishali, which originally meant a Shudra woman, later came to mean a harlot. Pamshila and Lanjika are later synonyms of harlots. Kulota was a married woman who left home to become a public woman, and Vandhaki was a housewife turned whore. Her husband was known as Vandhaka Posha, maintaining or being maintained by a Vandhaki. A Vandhaki too had to pay part of her income in the state coffers in times of national crisis. The Randa was a low common woman, a mistress to Vita, Vita, usually an old hag who pretended to be engaged in penance but was actually out to catch customers. The Ganika and sometimes the Rupa Jiva too received free training in the various arts, and colon quote opens, those who teach prostitutes, female slaves and actresses, arts such as singing, playing on musical instruments, reading, dancing, acting, writing, painting, playing on instruments such as veena, bracket lyre, lyre, bracket closes, pipe and drum, reading the thoughts of others, manufacture of scents and garlands, shampooing and the art of attracting and captivating the mind of others shall be endowed with maintenance from the state. Stop. They, the teacher shall train the sons of prostitutes to be chief actors, bracket Rangopa Jivin, bracket closes, on the stage. Stop. The wives of actors and others of similar profession who have been taught various languages and the use of signals, bracket opens, Samga, Samjna, bracket closes, shall, along with their relatives, be made use of, and in detecting the wicked and murdering and deluding foreign spies. Stop unquote, footnote 32, para. In a 6th century Jain work, we have an exhaustive list of the prostitutes' attainments, writing, arithmetic, the art, singing, playing on musical instruments, drums, chess, dice, 8-board chess, instant verse making, prakrit and apabhrangsha poetry, proficiency in the science of perfume making, jewelry, dressing up, knowledge of the signs of good or bad men and women, horses, elephants, cooks, rams, umbrellas, rods, swords, jewels, gems, which antidote poison architecture, camps and canopies, phalang, PHALANX, arrangement, fighting, fencing, shooting arrows, ability to interpret omens, etc. Stop. Altogether, 72 arts and sciences were to be mastered by her. Stop. Footnote 33. Para. It is clear that the prostitute, especially the Gonika, the most accomplished among them, offered men something which by the early centuries AD had become absolutely rare among the women of the gentry. For instance, accomplishment. We read in the Manu Samhita, colon, quote opens, page 203. The sacrament of marriage is to a female what initiation with the sacred thread is to a male. Stop. Serving the husband is for the wife what residence in the preceptor's house is to the man, and the household duty is to the woman, what offering sacrifices is to the man. Stop, unquote. Footnote 34. Para. This series of neat equations deprive the woman of education, dooming her to household chores only, especially service of her husband and in-laws, but also thereby indirectly doom her to the loss of her husband's attention. With an unaccomplished wife at home, the man who cared for cultural female company went to the brothel for it. Manu belongs to the early centuries AD, footnote 35, a steady deterioration in the status of the women, and the Shudra followed his codification of the social norm, and the brothel flourished because it catered to the cultured man about the towns, bracket opens, Nagaraka, bracket closes, tastes in women, para. The Ganika, because of her youth, beauty, training, and accomplishment, belonged to a superior social status. With an extensive, elaborate, and apparently expensive education, she could frequently name her price, which, as Buddhist texts testify, was often prohibitive. She was patronized by the king, who visited her sometimes, as also by wealthy merchants. Because of her high fees, none but the most wealthy could approach her. She alone enjoyed a position where, as long as her youth and beauty lasted, she could not be exploited. Next file, taxes to the state. Page 203. Taxes to the state. We have seen that the Gonika, Rupojiva, Veshya, and Vandaki had to pay taxes to the state, but a careful study leads to the conclusion that almost all categories had an actual or potential obligation for paying taxes. The collection, however, depended on the degree and nature of the organization. Organized red light areas paid taxes regularly at a fixed rate, while it was much more difficult to ascertain the income of the women, quote, kept, unquote, in seclusion by a man, or of the unorganized individual women plying the trade in isolated pockets, or even, like the Vandaki, at home. Similarly, organized brothels enjoyed greater security from the state in lieu of the taxes they paid, while individuals who paid, quote, hush money, unquote, to extortionist officers could hardly demand any protection from injustice, manhandling, coercion, and cheating. The Namya Sundari Kotha, a 12th century text, says that the state received 25% to 30% of the prostitute's income. page 204. Para. We hear of the extremely high fees of some famous gonikas in the Buddhist texts, Bhatti, Bhatti, footnote 36, and Parivvyam, Parivvyam, footnote 37, denote two different types of fees. Vasava Datta of Mathura charged very high rates per night, footnote 38. Salavati of Rajagriha charged 100 karsapanas per night, while Ambopali's fees led us to a dispute between the cities Rajagriha and Vaishali. A Jain text, footnote 39, says that a courtesan who had a faultless body and whose attainments were complete may charge 1,000 karshapanas per night. Evidently, only the richest merchants could pay such fees. The play Mritchakatika mentions 1,000 gold coins and ornaments being sent in advance to lure a Ganika to a paramour's house. The Ganika, says Kautilya, was also paid a monthly salary from the royal treasury, and the Pratigonika, her short-time substitute, received half the amount. The Ganika, however, did not enjoy property rights. Quote opens. There is every likelihood that their palatial establishments and gardens were state property with life interest. Stop unquote, footnote 40. On her death, her daughter inherited her property, but only for use. She could not sell, mortgage, exchange, or donate them. This, of course, is true of the ordinary prostitute living in an organized brothel. Many outstanding Gonikas were mistresses of their own property. Hence, in Buddhist literature, we have many instances where she gave away her property. A Ganika could be bought out by a sympathetic customer. Her redemption money, Nishkraya, Niskraya, was 24,000 panas, a very high sum in view of the fact that her annual salary paid by the state was between 1,000 and 3,000 panas. Arupa Jiva's fees were 48 panas. She usually lived with actors, wine sellers, meat sellers, people who sold cooked rice, and Vaishyas generally. It is obvious that she kept company with people who controlled ready cash. Para. A man who forcibly attacked a Gonika's daughter paid a fine of 54 panas plus a fine, shulka, of 16 times her mother's fees, presumably to the mother herself. Footnote 41. The second line may also be a hush money paid to the bridegroom at the daughter's wedding. Foreign customers had to pay 5 panas extra tariff due to the state apart from the courtesan's regular fees. The Puishali, the Pumschali, Pumscali, bracket, a common whore, bracket closes, did not have any fixed fees. She could only demand fees on marks of cohabitation. If she tried to extort money from her customers, her fees were liable to be forfeited to the state. Also, if she threw temper tantrums or refused to oblige the customer in any way, The Kuttani Mala says that the temple prostitute bracket opens 3 Dasha Laya Jivika bracket closes got paid by the temple authorities and that her income was fixed by tradition. Kshemendra's Samayana Trika says that they were paid in grain as remuneration and that they were employed in rotation. Page 205 para. If after receiving her fees, a prostitute refused to oblige her customer, she paid a fine of double her fees. If she refused him before accepting the fees, she paid her fees as fine. Footnote 42. Apparently, it is a fair business deal where the defaulter pays a fine. But if we pause and think that a sensible person would not ruin the prospects of gain or income unless she had some serious reason for disobliging her customer, it becomes clear that she did not have the option of refusing to sell herself. In other words, society refused to look upon her as a human being. She was just a commodity, nothing more. If a price had been accepted, the commodity was the customer's for use. Para. Regarding her customers, Vatsyayana is very clear. The ideal one is young, rich, without having to earn his wealth, that is, born to wealth, proud, a minister to the king, one who can afford to disregard his elders' commands, preferably an only son of a rich father. Born in an aristocratic family, he should be learned, a poet proficient in tales, an orator accomplished in the various arts, not malicious, lively, given to drinks, friendly, a ladies' man but not under their power, independent, not cruel, not jealous, not apprehensive. Footnote 43. The courtesan is advised not to stick to one visitor when she has offers from many. She should go to the person who can offer the gifts she covets. Footnote 44. Since money can buy everything, she should oblige him who can afford the highest sum. This, says the text, is what the teachers instruct. When she wants to bring her paramour back from a rival, she should be extra nice to him and be satisfied with less payment temporarily. This is to ensure her future, ... She should leave the impoverished lover and never invest in one from whom there is no hope of return. Footnote 45. She should be able to read the signs of his disaffection. A long list of such signs are given. Footnote 46. Above all, a courtesan should never encourage or entertain a suitor of reduced means. When she has squeezed her customer dry, she should remorselessly leave him and search for a rich one. Normally, a Ganika chose her own customer, except when the king forced one on her. Then, if she refused, she was whipped with 1,000 lashes or was fined 5,000 panas. She did not have any right over her own body where the royal wish was concerned. Footnote 47. The punishment for forcing an unwilling Ganika was 1,000 panas or more. Once she admits a client into her own house to share it with her, she could not throw him out. If she did, the fine was 8 times her fees. She could only refuse if he was deceased. When the client cheated her of her fees, he had to pay 8 times the fees. Para. The prostitute could own ornaments, money, her fees, servants. Page 206. Maidservants who could be concubines, but other texts indicate that this ownership was not real or ultimate, but merely a right of use. The concubine, however, was obliged to pay the mistress for her own upkeep plus 1 panna per month. Para. Prostitution in ancient India existed both overtly and covertly. In other words, besides brothels or open establishments run by and for one or more prostitutes, ancient texts give a list of many professions for girls where she could potentially be enjoyed by her employer with impunity. She could act as a substitute for the wife. In the Jain text, Vasudeva Hindi, we read of Bharata, a leader of his clan, having another woman besides the wife. All the feudatories under him sent their daughters who arrived at the same time. The queen threatened to leave, so it was decided that they would serve him in the outer court and that later they would be handed over to the Gana, the tribe, to become Ganikas. The text thus explains the origin of the term Ganika. The Mahabharata tells us that the Pandava army was followed by a host of prostitutes who went in the rear of the army on baggage carts. Footnote 46. Footnote 49. Yudhishthira in the train of the Pandavas, when they left for the forest, there were, quote, chariots, traders, goods, and brothels, unquote, presumably to entertain the army. Footnote 50. King Virata, after his victory, ordered young girls to dress well, come out, footnote 51, and entertain the assembled men. Such a command could only be given to public women. When Krishna went on a peace mission to the Kauravas, Duryodhana's entertainment of the former included a rest house with women. Dhritarashtra ordered fair harlots to go with his sons to meet Krishna. The later didactic interpolations of the Mahabharata, however, are full of imprecations and stigma against prostitute. Footnote 52. The Ramayana mentions Ganikas and Vaishyas in the list of comforts, luxuries, and status symbols. It is quite clear that prostitutes became a symbol of the prosperity concomitant with urban civilization. Like gold and jewelry, like corn and cattle, a rich man desired prosperity and plenty in the number of women he could enjoy freely. Next file, women as commodity. Page 206. Women as commodity. The concept of women as chattel, chattel, or commodity for man's enjoyment is borne out by the inclusion of women, pretty and young, in large numbers in any list of gifts given to a man in return for a favor or as a mark of respect. Thus, she is a part of dakshina, fees to a sacrificial priest. Page 207. As Yudhishthira's horse sacrifice, women were sent by other kings as a donation to make up a necessary part of the entertainment. Footnote 53. Yudhishthira himself gives away pretty maids to guest kings. Footnote 54. He is even said to have given away hundreds of thousands of pretty girls, as did King Shashabindu of old at his horse sacrifice. Footnote 55. Pretty maids as part of Dakshina are also mentioned when King Bhogiratha have hundreds of thousands of lovely maids well decked out with gold ornaments. Footnote 56. Even as a Shraddha ceremony, Brahmanas received thousands of pretty maidens as gifts. Footnote 57. These girls could sometimes find husbands, but presumably, since prostitution was being looked down upon more and more and maidenhood became an essential prerequisite for marriage in the Smriti texts, most of them were forced to become prostitutes. Para. In heaven, heroes are rewarded with a large number of beautiful girls. Footnote 58. The same idea is also seen in classical Sanskrit literature. In the Kumara Sambhava, footnote 59, Raghubangsha, footnote 60, Kiratarjuniya, footnote 61, and in Shishupala Badha, footnote 62, in Subandhu and Bana, we have references to courtesans as a prestigious decoration of a royal palace and an indispensable part of city life. Bhaguri calls her Pura Mandana, an ornament of the city. Thus, her status was that of an inanimate object of enjoyment. It was subhuman and subject. Para. Courtesans sometimes did perform several other functions. In the Mahabharata, they participated in the victory celebrations. Footnote 65. They even played a political role as spies, whose duty it was to seduce important men who were potential sources of vital political information, to collect such information and supply it to the relevant officers through the superintendent, bracket, Ganikadhyaksha, bracket closes, stop. Their role as temptress is emphasized in the Vattaka Jataka. The names of various types of courtesans gives us an inkling of their roles. Thus, the Deva Veshya was the temple dancer, something like the Greek hierodoules, Hierodoules. The Raja Veshya served the king, while the Brahma Veshya or Tirthaga visited holy places or pilgrimages. In the Brahma Purana, we have the description of Ekamatirtha, where lived many prostitutes, footnote 64, presumably to cater to the pilgrims and visitors. In the Samaja public functions, there used to be a separate gallery where sat the courtesans who gave musical performance for the Samaja. Kautilya assigns them the duties of common maidservants at the palace. We hear of a prostitute serving Dhritarashtra when Gandhari was pregnant. Footnote 65. Udyotana Suri in his Kuvalaya Mala describes nymphs in Indra's heaven who carried water vessels, fans, fly whisks, parasols, mirrors, page 208, kettle drums, harps, ordinary drums, clothes and ornaments. In the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, such women followed the king in the palace and served him in his train. The Lalita Vistara mentions women who carried full pitchers, garlands, jewelry and ornaments, the throne, the fan, jars full of perfume water, etc. Evidently, in all these instances, as also in many references in the Puranas and later literature, the pretty damsels giving light personal service to the king are projected to heaven, where the earthly prostitutes figure as celestial nymphs serving the gods. Whether on earth or in heaven, monarchs or wealthy potentates used such women to enhance their glory and pleasure. Para. The retired temple prostitute was employed by the state for spinning cotton, wool and flax. The Nagaraka, man about the town, in his love intrigues could have assistance from widows, Buddhist nuns and old courtesans who acted as go-betweens. In the palace, the courtesan held positions as the royal umbrella bearer, masseuse in charge of the kings, also of the royal family, toilet, dress and ornaments, and as the king's bathroom attendant. They also had a place in the royal entourage in hunting and military expeditions, and on occasion entertained royal guests. What is true of her function with regard to the king is also true of the rich courtier, merchant and nobles described as Nagaraka in the Kama Sutra. In the non-monarchical Ghana states, the chiefs gambled and indulged themselves in the company of prostitutes. The keepers of brothels procured pretty women from their establishment for these chiefs' entertainments. These aged women, the brothel keepers, were adept in bringing about and resolving quarrels between rival suitors as and when needed by them or by political agents of the state. Courtesans belonged to kings or wealthy citizens' trains in their amusements and festivals, their garden parties, boat trips, musical soirees, and bathing and drinking sprees. The Kama Sutra describes the different sports and festivals of rich barons, to each of which courtesans were invited. Top footnote 66. Para. The text goes on to name 20 different sports and festivals, footnote 67, which depended on the seasons, the moon and auspicious days of the year. Quote, villagers should learn of these sports of the townsmen, describe and imitate them, stop unquote, footnote 68. Para. No doubt the prostitutes occasionally enjoyed themselves at such times, but whether they spied, massaged, bathed, dressed, or carried the umbrella, we do not hear of any extra payment for these additional duties, to which they were certainly entitled because their main task as prostitutes only earned them a place in the king's or rich man's establishment. Page 209. In a sense, in the organized brothel, prostitutes were better off, because normally they were not expected to do other chores when with their customers, although they sometimes entertained them with mirror services. It all depended on the social and economic status of the prostitute. The city's chief courtesan was a wealthy person of a high rank who had a host of servants and met servants for the menial chores. She herself was too accomplished, rich and respectable to do the chores herself, whereas a poor and common strumpet had to cater to many customers, also indigent and therefore each able to pay very little. Hence she had to do all the menial chores for herself and her customer for bare subsistence. The Avarudha, a woman, quote, kept, unquote, by a man enjoyed freedom from manual labor only if her patron was rich. Otherwise, she had to work for herself and for him. Hers was like a, quote, contract marriage, unquote, and as in marriage, the status of the woman depended on the man's income. Continued in next file, social status. Page 209, social status. At this distance of time, it is difficult to form an adequate idea of the social status of prostitutes. We have seen that not all prostitutes belong to the same category. The accomplished young beauty could name her price, sometimes at an apparently exorbitant rate, because she was in great demand. Speaking of the ranks of royal attendants, the Kuru Dhamma Jataka says that the lowest of the courtiers was the doorkeeper, the Dwarika. He occupies the last place but one, for he is above the public woman, the Ganika. Every city had a chief courtesan who was, quote, an ornament to the city, unquote, footnote 69. The Janapada Kalyani or the Sadharani of the known monarchical state of the Lichavis were in great demand and were often looked up to because of their beauty and culture, and so could ask any price for their favors. And they got it, as many Buddhist texts testify. The word Janapada Kalyani literally means the most beautiful woman in a country. The Digha Nikaya, footnote 70, the Majjhima Nikaya, footnote 71, and the Sangyutta Nikaya, footnote 72, refer to her. Buddhist texts mention many affluent and powerful courtesans who fed the Buddha and his train and gave gifts to the order. We thus hear of Ambapali giving such a feast to the Lord and his 100,000 followers. She also gave away her big mango grove to the order, footnote 73. Shalavati's daughters, Sirima, received 1,000 kahapanas per night, footnote 74. We hear of a banker's daughter who chose to become a prostitute, page 210. Her father set too high a price. Few customers came. She reduced it to half and was called Ardhakshi, footnote 75. Para. As looks, age and accomplishments came down, the price and social prestige also came down, so that middle-aged, unaccomplished or plain-looking women had to agree to mere subsistence rates or even less. Even that they did not always get, as many texts on erotics tell us. The Kuttani Mata, a major text on prostitution, describes the plight of such discarded prostitutes who were reduced to begging, stealing, and various other tricks. They had no guarantee of the next meal or shelter, no provision against old age, disease, and penury. The heartrending description of an abandoned, unattractive prostitute who takes recourse to becoming a confidence trickster and is pursued by society is occasionally rendered ludicrous by the very comicality of her various moves and the invariable failure of each move. But beyond this comic portrait is the tragic situation of a woman who, after having provided pleasure to many men's lust all through her life, has to fend for herself at a time when she is worst equipped for such a lone battle. In many texts, we hear of such retired harlots begging. Footnote 76. The classic example is Kankali, an innkeeper's daughter, sold at 7 as a slave in the marketplace, who started as an ordinary prostitute and in time lost her youth and whatever charm she had earlier had. So she tried her hand at different professions, but since she had no training in any, she could not earn a livelihood through them. Then she tried to seduce people at pilgrimages, dressing up and disguising her age and loss of looks, but was eventually caught and summarily dropped. She changed roles frequently, was even imprisoned in a bid to escape. She murdered the warder. She then fled to a monastery where she could not stick it for very long. Later she begged openly until there was a famine and she could not get alms. So she became a nurse to a child whose gold chain she stole one night and escaped. When that money was exhausted, she took to selling loaded dice. Then she returned to begging as a profession. But the strain and poor returns prompted her to steal food offered to idols. She next became a wine seller, a fortune teller, and an actress in turn, and finally she went about pretending to be insane. For a time she enjoyed royal hospitality because she gave out that she could paralyze a hostile army. But quite naturally, she had to take to her heels before the actual encounter took place. Finally, she returned to her native place and became a procuress for a pretty young prostitute, Kalavati, footnote 77. This tells evidently a concatenation of many desperate episodes, page 211, epitomizes the fate of old prostitutes. Their tragedy was not only the lack of social security, but also their lack of proficiency in any alternative profession through which they could earn a livelihood. Besides having known better days, they could not stick to any mean profession which did not provide comfort. Hence they flitted from one profession to another with cunning and the ability to cheat through play acting, arts they had mastered as prostitutes, as the only stock in trade. In the Desopadesha, we hear of a 60-year-old woman making herself up as a young girl in the hope of catching a customer. Footnote 78, para. Institutionalized prostitution, however, offered somewhat better prospects for old and retired courtesans. Kautilya lays down the rule that gonikas, pratigonikas, short-term substitutes for the ganikas, rupa jivas, veshyas, dasis, devadasis, pumschalis, shilpa karikas, kausikashtri, woman artisan, are to be given pension by the state in old age. Since Kautilya was writing for a prince, it is to be assumed that these women were employed by the state and had earlier paid taxes to the state, which the state regarded partially as provident fund contributions against old age, disability, retirement, and penury. We are not told what the pension was in terms of money, whether it was adequate for sustenance. But a steady income, however small, must have meant some measure of security to elderly women who would otherwise be wholly destitute. But since women and their labor were exploited in most spheres of life, we may assume that this rule was not strictly observed, because such women were totally powerless to sue the state for non-payment. Yet the few who actually received some pension were lucky to have it. Retired prostitutes were employed as cooks, storekeepers, cotton wool and flax spinners, and in various other manual jobs, so the state did not have to pay the pension until they were too old and weak to work anymore. In old age, some prostitutes became matrikas, that is, matrons in charge of a brothel. Para. We hear of prostitutes' Anvaya, Anvaya family, their mothers, sisters, daughters, and sons. The mother looked after her personal possessions, like dress and ornaments. She could not deposit her ornaments anywhere else. The daughter inherited them on her mother's retirement or death, but only for use. The sister could act as her substitute in a commission, and the son was trained as a musical artist or an actor. He became a property of the state, almost a slave, and was obliged to hold musical performances for the stage for 8 years. The manumission fees, manumission, manumission fees for him was higher than that for the prostitute. Page 212. But in the play Mritchakatika, we hear of bandhulas, quote, who are begotten by unknown clients of the prostitutes, unquote, stop. Without any social identity, these boys lived in a brothel until they could eke out a livelihood for themselves. The pathetic tone of the verse tells us how these boys were looked upon as waste products, like slag in a factory. Para. A prostitute was obliged to keep the brothel superintendent posted about her income and expenses, and he could stop her from being extravagant. She could not sell or mortgage her property at will. For doing so, she paid a fine. 50 and a quarter panas. Para. Occasionally, a prostitute was married. Vatsyayana lays down a provision whereby a Vaishya could be given in marriage to one who could provide special musical assistance to the establishment. Such a marriage leads to greater prosperity. Footnote 79. Otherwise, we hear of a notional sort of marriage which was more in the nature of initiation. The man did not have any exclusive claim on her person or services. The avarudha belonged to her patron exclusively, and the lawgivers say that his exclusive right to her should be respected. Footnote 80. Narada has no objections to a man having sexual relations with a non-Brahmana Swaidini, Vaishya, Dasi, and Nikashini, bracket opens, one who did not live a secluded life, bracket closes, of a lower caste if she was not another's wife. Para. That even a prostitute can fall in love is admitted theoretically by Vatsyayana, even though he says that they are and should always be after money. Footnote 81. A prostitute, according to the Skanda Purana, belongs to a separate caste. If a man of the same or superior caste enjoys her, he is not to be punished, provided she is not another's concubine. If she is, then he simply performs prajapatya, bracket, a light, bracket closes, penance, footnote 82, and gets away with it. In literature, we have a few instances of the prostitute falling in love. Stop, footnote 83. Next file, vilification in literature. Page 212. Prostitution in ancient India. Vilification in literature. Both institutionally and individually, prostitutes depended upon certain categories of middlemen and procurers. Chief among these was the Kuttanai, Kuttani, Kuttani, or Sambhali, Sambhli. Now in a brothel, the mother of the chief prostitute was the person in charge who watched over her daughters and the other girls' interests. Her duties included checking the payments, protecting the girls' health and wealth, driving away undesirable customers, bracket opens, that is, those with depleted coffers, bracket closes, using deceit and delay tactics to spare the girls as much as possible, bargaining for greater emoluments by pretending that other richer customers are making bigger offers, varying custom, that is to deprive an eager one for a time in order to extort better fees from him. Stop. Footnote 84, page 213. No wonder she was vilified in literature. Quote, she is like a bloodthirsty tigress, only where she is absent does the client appears as a fox. Stop, unquote. Quote, the Kuttani with her ear glued to the door in greedy expectation of money becomes eager even when a blade of grass drops. Stop, unquote. Footnote 85. The Kama Sutra mentions these procuresses together with beggar women, cultivated women, female mendicants with shaven heads, Chandala women, and old prostitutes. Footnote 86. Apparently she is an old hag with the nature of a vampire, but if one praises to think she was the prostitute's only guarantee of safety and fair payment. Without her, if the prostitute had to deal with the customer directly, she could be cheated, robbed, insulted, maimed, even killed with impunity. The basis of this surmise is offered by Kautilya in his Arthashastra, where we read that the fine for defamation of a courtesan was 24 panas, for assault 48 panas, and for lopping off her ears 51-3/4 panas, and forced confinement. The Yagnavalkya Smriti says that the fine for molesting a prostitute is 50 panas, and if she is gang raped, each assailant had to pay 24 panas to her. Footnote 87. For the safety of her person, some laws had to be framed, and for graver crimes, the penalty varied between 1,000 and 48,000 panas, according to the degree of the heinousness of the crime and the status of the injured courtesan. Para. On the other hand, later religious and law books have nothing but contempt for courtesans and hold them solely responsible for the institution. They go to the length of saying that the murder of a prostitute is no crime. Footnote 88. Manu believes that all prostitutes were thieves and swindlers. Footnote 89. It is true that the erotic text Kala Vilasa lists 64 specified modes in which a courtesan could deceive her customer. It also tells us the story of King Vikramaditya, who, when he fell on hard days, became the prostitute Vilasavati's guest. She showered her own wealth on him, and when he gave himself out to be dead, threw herself on his pyre. With her help he regained his kingdom and made her the chief queen. Then she confessed to him her love for a young man who was arrested as a thief. With the king's help he was freed, and the lovers were united. Then the king remembered his minister's warning, "They are not to be trusted." This innate deceitfulness of prostitutes is a recurring note in all literature. But in this instance, the text ignores her contribution, the reinstatement of the king as sovereign, and betrays only a sneer shared, no doubt, by the entire community. For the possibility of a prostitute, page 214, being in love so deeply that she treads a dangerous and tortuous path to gain her love appear totally absurd to them. The text condemns the woman for everything, and more so the prostitute, wholly ignoring her client's role and her own contribution to his career. Para, we have just seen that their clients also maltreated and manhandled them, and these were not isolated incidents or exceptions, or there would be no need to frame laws against crimes and stipulate the exact amount of fines for the several kinds of assault. She was often used and then cheated, robbed, mutilated, and murdered. If the institution was for a society a necessary evil and the state had a vested interest in extracting revenue and espionage service from the quote evil unquote karma, then it could not afford to ignore a situation when the source of such revenue was harmed so that she could not multiply the revenue. Hence the laws, but the attitude of society was clearly against the prostitute and not against her client. Para. The vita, V-I-T-A, was the middleman and / or companion of the courtesan. Because the vita was a man, he could procure customer for her. Technically, a vita was a worthy spendthrift who, reduced to penury, takes shelter, bracket open, sometimes with his wife, bracket closes, in a brothel or in similar pleasure resorts. Footnote 90. The vitas are counselors of both the courtesans and their clients and could bring about misunderstandings between them and also reconcile them with each other. The Pitha Marda, Pithamarda, on the other hand, was a teacher of the prostitute, as also an associate of the Nagaraka, the man about the town who helped his friend achieve his ends. Footnote 91. Both, but especially the Vita, looked after the courtesan's interests where she needed a man to help her. In the Mricha Katika, he escorts her in a dark night, instructs her when she goes to seek pleasure, has no illusion about the profession but has respect for her as a person. In the four famous bhanas of the late classical period, the Vitas are helpers, peacemakers, go-betweens, procurers, and counselors of the partners. Evidently, the courtesan was also helpless against certain situations, so that she shared her income with a male go-between for protecting her own interests. This and the services of the Kuttani already signify that the courtesan was liable to be exploited, cheated, insulted, and physically injured. The Vita, apparently a parasite, gave valuable service to her, where her sex and social position rendered her vulnerable. Para. As townships sprang up along trade routes and as rich men long way from home frequented these brothels, this became a regular feature with the chief courtesans, beauty queens being regarded as ornaments of the town or city. Page 215. Nagara Sadhani or Nagara Mandana, because she was in high demand and because she would fetch a rich revenue if she was accomplished and attractive, the state undertook to surprise her education, bracket opens, with quite a heavy and rigorous syllabus, bracket closes, at its own expense, provided she remitted part of her income to the state. Not only was she obliged to pay revenue to the state, she often undertook some works for public welfare. Thus we read in the Brihata Kalpava, a giant text of a picture gallery set up by a courtesan. The Buddhist texts record Ambapali as also giving similar services. Other courtesans fed the hungry during a famine, gave away money, land, and property for the Buddhist cause. Many treated the Buddha and monks to sumptuous feasts. Frequently, when the courtesans amassed wealth, they set up works of public utility. They sank wells, constructed bridges, temple gardens, chaityas, that is sacred mounds, donated money to the needy, gave gifts, and generally served the community through such works for public utility. Para. Yet we read in the Mahabharata that the prostitutes' quarters should be situated in the south, because that is the direction of Yama, the god of death. In the Manasollasa, a medieval text, we read that houses of ill fame should be situated on the outskirts of the town. But in Greece, the courtesans had a different status. One of the most beautiful sections of any Grecian city was where the richest of the courtesans built their houses. The lyric poem Pavanaduta of Dhoi, Dhoi, describing the temple prostitutes says, "It seemed that Lakshmi, the goddess of beauty, has herself descended there." Kalhana, in his Rajatarangini, mentions an extremely qualified Devadasi by the name of Kamala. In some Puranas, we read of the Ahanga Vrata, a rite which signified temple prostitution. Footnote 92. The Kama Sutra lays down that she should always be decked out with jewelry and without being fully visible, should street walk discreetly, quote, because she is a commodity, unquote, stop, footnote 93. The same text defines her conduct, colon, quote, without really getting attached to her client, she should act as if she were, semicolon. She should submit to her cruel and mendacious mother, and if the mother is not there, she should submit to the matron of the house, stop. She has the right of use of her ornaments, comma, food and drinks, comma, garlands, comma, perfumes, comma, etc., stop, unquote, footnote 94. Quote, she should pretend the loss of her own and her client's ornaments, comma, should engage in a mock quarrel with her mother on the subjects of excessive expenses, and having to incur debts, comma, should make the client pay her bills, comma, should pretend to be obliged to sell her ornaments in order to make both ends meet, comma, should report about her rivals, apostrophe, greater income, comma, etc., stop, unquote, footnote 95. If this long list of deception is any index of how society expected her to conduct herself in her profession, one fails to understand the bitter censure society meted out to her when she complied. Para. The Raja Toronginiya poetical chronicle of Kashmir records that King Lalita Pida gave out that anyone proficient in courtesan lore and clever at jokes would become his friend. Later literature has no inhibition in mentioning or describing courtesans attached to the palace, to the manor houses of the nobility, especially of merchants, and to temples as well as those who lived in brothels. Such descriptions in Kalidasa, Bharavi, Dandin, Bhatti, Subandhu, Banabhatto, Sriharsho, bracket, Noishada Charita, bracket closes, are totally uninhibited and done with great gusto and skill. Yet other didactic texts are full of imprecations against prostitutes. The Vishnu Samhita lays down that he who associates with a courtesan should perform the Prajapatya penance. Footnote 96. The vituperation against prostitutes begins in the didactic section of the Mahabharata, the Dharmashastra, bracket, many of which belong to the age of the Brahminical interpolation of the Mahabharata, bracket closes, and continue through the Puranas and Smriti texts. Such texts choose to ignore the fact that quotations are not born but made. They can only exist as long as society has a demand for them. Therefore, since a section of society calls courtesans into being to cater to their need, the condemnation should be shared by that section as well. But apart from mild, half-hearted penalties, more in the nature of not too obvious strictures and threats of notional ostracism, the male clients go morally scot-free. Para. This double standard is not an isolated phenomenon. It is the product of a rooted ambivalence in the society's consciousness. Since the designation of Ganika was the highest and had to be earned through beauty, charm, and accomplishments, footnote 97, it signified the highest social class among prostitutes. Kautilya says that the superintendent of prostitutes conferred the title of Ganika to the pretty, young, and cultured Hetaira, Hetaira, footnote 98. She drew 1,000 panas from the state, presumably for her establishment, and her teachers in the various arts were also paid by the state. She had a measure of social security in the sense that those who harmed her physically, financially, and socially were liable to be punished heavily by the state. Needless to say that such a coveted position was not accorded to many. Only a handful of the prostitutes were made Ganikas, whose favors were enjoyed by kings, princes, and the riches of the merchants. Page 217. It can be guessed that pretty young women with real cultivated taste and accomplishments flocked to well-governed towns and cities where they could not be molested by wrecks and ruffians with impunity and where trade and commerce thrived. Even in such townships as well as in prosperous villages, women with less beauty and culture and presumably older in age plied their trade as Rupajivas and Vaishyas, depending on their age, accomplishments, and charm. The Vaishya may have relied on her clothes and jewelry, bracket Vaishya, V-E-S-A, bracket closes, for attracting customers. The Avarudha, as we have seen, was the mistress of an individual in the role of a concubine. The relationship was temporary, but while it lasted, society respected its rights. The Puinchali, Puinscali, Vara Vilasine, Swairini, Kulota, etc., were free agents who were out to turn whatever charm they had to the best financial capital. Sometimes they employed middlemen to attract customers, and sometimes they hawked themselves. From all accounts, they had less to offer and therefore earned much less. The Devadasis were a class by themselves who, because they were attached to institutions, that is temples, governed directly or indirectly by the state, enjoyed some degree of protection. Para. Just what the social background of these unfortunate girls was is far from clear. Apart from the parents making a devotional gift of their daughters to the temple, footnote 99, there must have been the daughters of Devadasis or distressed cells of girls to the temple, recruitment of local beauties under moral pressure, or girls abducted from helpless parents, girls won as war booty or recruited through superstitious practice. However they came in, it is quite clear that it was an all India and age-long phenomenon. Even though the Madras Legislative Assembly banned it by law in 1929, it persisted there and in the rest of India, and still persists in many pockets after it was banned all over India by a legislation in 1947. The overt duty of the Devadasis was to dance at the time of the evening worship in the temple, but they were also treated as concubines by the temple priests. Kalidasa refers to them as Vaishyas and describes them as enjoying the first drops of monsoon rain as a welcome relief to their tired limbs. Para. Once inside the temple and under the thumb of the priests, they became like slaves with no clear definition of their rights and duties. The Kuttani Mata does mention payment from temple authorities, but this evidently did not mean anything more than subsistence and clothes and ornaments for them as temple dancers. In the Samaya Matrika, footnote 100, we hear of grains being given to Devadasis who danced in rotation. In the 3rd century BC Jogi Mara inscription, we hear of Devadatta's love for the Devadasi Sutanuka, page 218. Many other cave inscriptions, footnote 101, mention the music and dance provided by courtesans and Devadasis. Since major treatises are nearly all silent on the duties and rights of the Devadasis, it appears that they were completely at the mercy of the temple priest, a specially privileged section in Indian society who enjoyed immunity from the penal code and were thus free to exploit these girls as they pleased. Evidently here too the more talented beauties coming from the upper rung of society enjoyed somewhat fairer treatment than those born to temple prostitutes or recruited from destitute parents or as rich men's gifts or war booty. But because the masters of these prostitutes, the priests, enjoyed privilege both through their sacerdotal office and through royal patronage, the Devadasis' position was more abject than presumably of those organized in the brothels regarding whose rights and privileges some rules had been clearly enunciated. The very helplessness of the Devadasis must have led to the widespread distribution of the institution and its prolonged continuation in the name of religion. The violent resistance and opposition of the hieratic, Hieratic, hieratic section, especially in South India, when its abolition was proposed, testifies to the nature and measure of the priest's vested interest in the institution. Para. What happened to the Devadasi when she grew old? Presumably, not all of them enjoyed royal patronage. Those who did were employed in the state textile factory, as we find in the solitary mention of the Devadasi in Kautilya. Footnote 102. Dancing was the only art she had learned, and she could not practice it in old age, so that if she was one of those who did not enjoy royal care, she would be reduced to destitution. Her profession prevented her from having a family, and her long stay in the temple isolated her from society. Therefore, even if she worked in a textile factory for a time, she would face penury in real old age when both the temple and the community cast her off as wholly redundant. Thus, at the end of a long career of double exploitation, as a temple dancer and as the priest's concubine, she faced complete destitution, for neither the state nor the temple had any obligation to look after her. Para. It is both rewarding and revealing to turn the pages of dictionaries on the subject of prostitution. Apart from older, that is Vedic, and later Vedic terms like Agru, Hasra, Atiskadwari, and Vrishali, each of which emphasized one aspect of the public women, we have a host of later synonyms which varied with time and place. Page 219. The standard Sanskrit lexicon Amarakosha says that Vaishya, Varastri, Ganika, and Rupajiva are synonyms. Jotadhara adds Kshudra and Shalabhanjika, semicolon. The Sabdaratnavali has a few more entries. Jharjhara, Shula, Varavilasine, Varavati, Mandavashini, while the Shabdamala adds Lanjika, Vandhura, Kunta, Kimarekha, and Varavati. The standard dictionary of Hemachandra has Sadharanastri, Parangana, Bhunjika, and Varavadhu, to which the Rajanirkhanto lexicon adds Bhogya and Smaravitika. Even a cursory glance at these names tells us that while some signify the profession itself, others like Kshudra, Shula, Kanta, Bhandabhashini, Bhunjika, Bhogya, or Smaranvitika express society's sneer and contempt. Para. In the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, we read that a woman loyal to her husband is Ekapatni, wife to one. If she goes to another, she is a Kulota. Footnote 103. If she goes to three, she is a Vrishali, a Pumshali, with a fourth, a Vaishya, with a fifth and sixth, a Yungi, with a seventh and eighth. Above that, she becomes a Mahaveshya, whom no one of any caste may touch. Footnote 104. Although it appears that all except the Mahaveshya may be touched, that is not true. The Dharmashastras generally lay down that visiting a prostitute is a crime, but since they also prescribe mild expiatory rites, it appears that society did not look upon it as either a heinous crime or an irremediable sin. Para. As we have seen, there is an evident ambivalence regarding the profession. The Samaya Pradipa, a late ritual text, mentions the sight of a prostitute as an auspicious sign. A man gains his desire if he sees her on setting out a journey. Other such items are obviously auspicious, like a cow with its cuff, a bull, a horse or a chariot, fire with its flame, turning to the right, a goddess, a full pitcher, garlands, banners, white rice, etc. The only apparently inauspicious item in the catalogue is the prostitute. Yet a sight of her is regarded as a good omen. Similarly, soil from near a prostitute's house is an essential item for fashioning the image of Durga, the goddess of cardinal importance in Bengal. The mystery is solved when we remember the role of the prostitute in the earlier rituals where she had to copulate with a man or engage in a mock altercation with a neophyte, the brahmacharin, in an exchange of obscenities. In all of these instances, the same incentive is noticeable. For example, fertility. Her very profession involved repeated sexual relations with many men and so potentially symbolized fertility and the power of reproduction. For a community whose prosperity and wealth depended on ensuring fertility of the field and of cattle, she symbolized the fertility principle. Hence her place in rituals. The association of fertility of field and cattle with the sexual act, page 220, especially magnified in the prostitute's profession, is not unique to India. Para. But apart from this aspect, society unambiguously looked down upon the profession. All its efforts at segregating of the rest of the community from contagion through the prostitute's proximity, the rule of allocating an area in the south, Yama's direction outside the common habitat for the brothel, the prohibition against eating food offered by her, the rule against touching or associating with her signify this contempt. But this is obviously a later development, for the Kama Sutra describes kings, courtiers, and the mercantile nobility of the cities and towns, and also of villages, as indulging in the company of courtesans. The attitude there is totally uninhibited. The Arthashastra too presupposes the existence of prostitution as an institution and has no value judgment regarding them. Underlying both of these texts is the assumption that this institution has been brought into existence not by the perversity of certain women or by an aberration in any section, but by a social need. A society which virtually forbade female education and relegated the woman to virtual subordination under the husband and in-laws reduced her to a chattel who could serve and for a time cater to the man's sexual needs, but after children started coming and she became sorely taxed in her strenuous household obligations, nursing and bringing up the children, she was no, quote, fun, unquote, anymore. para. Apart from this, man must have desired companionship in his intellectual and aesthetic pursuits from men, friends, as well as from women. This entirely normal and healthy desire could in no way be satisfied by the wife, who, encumbered with household duties and children, soon lost youth and charm, and whose husbands were therefore driven to prostitutes. But evidently not all men did so, and those who did it in a surreptitious manner. All that charmed a man in a prostitute was forbidden for the wife, who should be uneducated, demure, and plainly dressed except on ritual occasions. She was primarily a housewife, busy with her chores, children, and in-laws, which left her little leisure for the cultivation of either her books, dress, or mental faculties. Society expected her to be good, hard-working, devoted, and obedient. This was bound to make her less attractive to her husband, who craved for charm and companionship in a woman. This very need of combining sexual pleasure with intellectual aesthetic companionship, or simply with the charm of a good-looking, youthful person, page 221, tastefully decked out in clothes and jewelry, attracted men to prostitutes, and repelled them precisely because she could not be exclusively possessed, for she was enjoyed by many. In a society where women became a personal possession, a woman who could not be possessed individually provoked this ambivalence. Next file, women as chattel.